Life in prison is difficult for even the most hardened criminals. But some prisons are so remote, they seem totally detached from the rest of society. Today, we're looking at the top 10 most isolated prisons in the world. Alcatraz is perhaps the most famous prison in the world. Located just off the coast of San Francisco, this island prison has been converted into a museum in recent years. But from 1934 to 1963, Alcatraz was the most high-security prison in the United States, and it housed some of the most dangerous criminals of the day. The prison had a reputation as the toughest prison in the country. Famous inmates include gangster Al Capone, the godfather of Harlem, Bumpy Johnson, and the original Machine Gun Kelly. These inmates were known for their brutality, and several prisoners were murdered by fellow Alcatraz inmates. During its 29 years of operation, the penitentiary claimed that no prisoner successfully escaped. A total of 36 prisoners made 14 escape attempts, 2 men trying twice, 23 were caught, 6 were shot and killed during their escape, 2 drowned, and 5 are listed as missing and presumed drowned. The currents were extremely strong and no inmate succeeded in swimming to the mainland. Spring Creek Correctional Center is a maximum security, state-operated adult correctional institution located in Seward, Alaska. With over 500 inmates behind bars, this prison has a large population of prisoners held in horrible conditions. Not only is the weather brutally cold, it's extremely difficult for visitors to reach the penitentiary in the winter. Alaska is already extremely isolated, and although there are more populated areas in the Great Northern State, Spring Creek is located in the middle of a 300-acre national park. Most of these inmates have committed violent crimes and will likely spend the rest of their lives in prison without experiencing warm weather. An Alaskan woman made headlines in 2015 when she approached the prison with a gun and demanded that all the prisoners go free. Obviously, the guards refused. Although this prison is from antiquity, it still has a reputation as one of the most isolated prisons in history. The Romans used this location to torture criminals and captured enemies from around their domain. The brutal prison was located underground, where inmates would spend a lifetime without human interaction or sunlight. Believe it or not, this ancient prison was built in 640 BC. Most of its famous inmates, like Eumenes III of Pergamum, were people who rebelled against the Roman Empire. The emperors didn't take kindly to rebellion and usually executed these individuals. This building was initially used as an underground cistern, but soon the Romans converted it into a pitch-black prison. Criminals were lowered into the dungeon through an opening in the roof. According to legend, both St. Peter and St. Paul were imprisoned here at different times. You've probably heard of Robben Island because it famously held South African activist and politician Nelson Mandela. Located 11 miles from Cape Town, South Africa, the island prison was used to hold political prisoners. In the 1800s, it was also used as a leper colony and an animal quarantine station. Robben Island is surrounded by rocks and treacherous seas. In the 20th century alone, there were 17 shipwrecks on its shores, and no human could possibly survive a swim to the mainland. Dutch settlers founded the prison in the 1700s and used it as a tool in their brutal oppression and eventually apartheid of native South Africans. Over the years, many prisoners, including Nelson Mandela himself, described the inhumane conditions on Robben Island. When Mandela arrived, a guard informed him that he would die on the penal colony. In reality, Mandela served 18 years before finally becoming South Africa's president and living to be 95 years old. Guantanamo Bay is an extremely controversial prison located in a remote part of Cuba. It was opened in coordination with George W. Bush's War on Terror in 2002. It has an ocean on one side and a barren desert on the other, making it impossible to escape. The international community has expressed outrage over the blatant human rights abuses at Guantanamo Bay. Prisoners are held without trial or access to legal guidance. They are imprisoned in constant solitary confinement and tortured both through psychological and physical means. Famously, inmates at Guantanamo are subjected to waterboarding, wherein water is poured over a cloth on their face, which simulates the sensation of drowning. There are still 39 miserable inmates held at Guantanamo Bay, many of whom have been held for decades in a hellish purgatory. Even worse, several of the people held at the prison were later proven innocent. They include an Afghan college student and a German businessman. Attempts to close Guantanamo Bay have been unsuccessful for more than a decade. Many people refer to ADX Supermax as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. This daunting facility was created to house all of the prisoners who are too violent for the traditional penal system. Of the 338 prisoners, most have been extremely violent to other prisoners or guards in other prison facilities around the country. Inmates spend a minimum of 23 hours a day in their cells. If they exhibit good behaviour, they can spend an hour outside, although they are still closely monitored. Prisoners' muscles atrophy from a lack of use and they have virtually no access to human contact. This Colorado prison houses the surviving Boston Marathon bomber, the Oklahoma City bomber, and the terrorist from the first World Trade Center bombing. Unlike most Ultramax prisons, ADX Supermax doesn't offer views of the surrounding world. Inmates cannot see the sky or even a nearby road. Of course, no one has ever had the opportunity to escape from this hellish prison. Few prison systems have been more brutal than the gulags of Russia. Black Eagle Prison, also known as Penal Colony 56, was Russia's answer to disallowing the death penalty in 1997. But this prison dates all the way back to Soviet times. Similar to ADX Supermax, inmates are only allowed to leave their cell for a maximum of 1 hour a day. They cannot ever go outside and simply stand in a room with no roof. During the day, prisoners are prohibited from laying in their beds, and at night they are forced to sleep with the lights on. Every day, the guards read aloud the crimes of each inmate, and their felonies are written on their doors in order to shame them. Australia has a bare-bones processing centre called Nauru, located on an island near Papua New Guinea. Sadly, this location is not for prisoners, but rather for refugees who have not applied for asylum correctly in the Australian system. They are held in squalid conditions, essentially sleeping in open-air tents. The island is such a remote corner of the Pacific Ocean that refugees have no choice but to wait and wander through the complicated bureaucratic process. According to Al Jazeera, the inmates have limited access to shelter, food, and clean drinking water. Several of the detainees complain of abuse during their time at the Nauru Regional Processing Centre. Located deep in the freezing waters of White Lake in Russia, Paytak Island Prison earned the nickname Alcatraz of Russia. Violent crimes and political dissidents can only leave their quarters for 90 minutes a day, and they can only receive a maximum of 2 visitors a year. This place destroys people, said prison psychologist Svetlana Kiselova. The first 9 months or so they spend adapting. After 3 or 4 years, their personalities begin to deteriorate. There's no way anyone can spend 25 years in a place like this without being psychologically destroyed. One inmate summarised Paytak Island's hopelessness when he told The Telegraph, "This is the worst. There are no lavatories, no proper washing facilities, and you spend your whole life in a cell. When I came here, I told my wife to get a divorce. She cried a little, and we've never seen each other since." In that same report, another inmate, Vladimir, said simply, "I've made this room my home. One day it will be my mausoleum." Even if prisoners manage to swim through the Siberian lake, the perimeter is monitored by a watchtower, and they would likely freeze to death soon afterward. North Korea already has an international reputation for flouting human rights laws and brutally torturing its own citizens. But Camp 22 near the Chinese border takes the regime's cruelty to new extremes. Camp 22 has been described as more concentration camp than prison. According to reports, inmates are denied food and must catch and kill frogs and rats in order to survive. Because North Korea has many enemies, Camp 22 is packed with more than 50,000 inmates. Human rights groups have decried Camp 22 as a modern-day Holocaust. Prisoners, many of whom are only guilty of criticising the government, are forced to perform hard labour all day. They receive a single pair of clothes that will need to last them their entire life. North Korea continues to deny the existence of this barbaric concentration camp, but aerial photos reveal it's still in use to this day.